Okay, now we're going to shift topics to coral reefs, which are also located in the aquatic life zone in the marine nearshore environment. A key term I want to draw your attention to is on the picture, zooanthellae. These are single-celled algae that can be yellow, green, brown, and live in the cytoplasm of certain marine invertebrates, otherwise known as coral. Coral reefs are underwater structures that are built primarily of limestone and form in clear, warm coastal waters of the tropics and subtropics. They are highly productive ecosystems that are just dazzling centers of biodiversity. The reefs form massive colonies of polyps that secrete limestone. Coral reefs result from a mutually beneficial relationship between polyps and single-celled algae called zooxanthellae that live in the tissues of these polyps. Coral reefs make up less than 1% of our ocean. However, they are so vital and important to our marine ecosystems. They shelter about 25% of the marine species. They also help to protect shorelines and act as a natural barrier that prevents the coastlines from erosion by waves and storms. In addition, coral reefs are definitely a targeted area for our fishing industry due to the amount of biodiversity that is there. And coral reefs produce about 10% of the global fish catch, even though they represent less than 1% of our ocean. They provide fishing jobs for some of the world's poorest countries. Recreation and tourism is a no-brainer that everyone that has had the opportunity to snorkel along a coral reef was just in awe of the beauty and the color. There is thought from the field of science that the coral reefs could provide the next big undiscovered medical breakthrough due to the high biodiversity of the corals and potential harvesting of the corals to make medications to treat cancer and or other illnesses. Also, coral reefs help improve water quality. They act as a filter that traps things floating in the water, which makes water cleaner for the marine environment. So a coral reef must have sunlight to grow. That is why they hardly ever occur in waters deeper than 45 feet. So they're most likely to be found in tropical oceans where the water is clearer and warmer. Coral reefs are fragile and easily damaged because they grow so slowly. Hence, it's important to protect our coral reefs. Almost 45 to 53% of the world's shallow coral reefs have been destroyed or degraded by coastal development, pollution, overfishing, warmer ocean temperatures, increasing ocean acidity, and other stresses. A prolonged spike in water temperature of 1.8 to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit can be enough to kill corals. Greenhouse gas emissions are acidifying the ocean water by the natural absorption of carbon dioxide into the ocean from the atmosphere. This is part of the normal carbon cycle. However, more CO2 in the atmosphere results in more CO2 being absorbed in the oceans, and CO2 reacts in the ocean to create what's known as a weak carbonic acid. This slight change in acidity in the ocean water can dissolve the coral calcium skeletons. About 30 years ago, massive coral die-offs were unheard of, but today reefs are suffering through the third global bleaching event since 1998. More than 80% of the northern part of Australia's Great Barrier Reef is actually bleached white. Other factors like extra bright sunlight, especially when combined with the aforementioned warm seawater, disease, pollution from runoff, changes in the saltiness of seawater, and sedimentation from undersea activities like dredging are also stress factors that can lead to coral bleaching. This diagram depicts the three phases of coral bleaching. The first starts out with a healthy coral, where the coral and the algae depend on each other to survive, and this is known as a symbiotic relationship. Basically, the microscopic algae called zooxanthellae that live in the coral tissues these algae grow and are the coral's primary food source and give them their color. When the symbiotic relationship becomes too stressful due to maybe increased ocean temperature or pollution, the algae actually leave the coral tissue, and the result is that the coral looks bleached or white. Without the algae, the coral loses its major source of food, turns white or very pale, and is more susceptible to disease. So where has coral bleaching occurred? Anywhere there's a coral reef, there's the possibility of coral bleaching to happen. Most commonly, the coral bleaching is occurring 20 degrees north to 20 degrees south of the equator in this strip around the world. The Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Caribbean are areas where most of the coral bleaching has occurred. Some specific coral reefs that have been affected include the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, as depicted here on this map, the Papahanaumokai Marine National Monument in Hawaii, the Red Sea Coral Reef in the Red Sea close to Israel and Egypt, and the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef in the Gulf of Mexico, which is close to Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. This diagram shows you a time reference of coral bleaching between 1998 and 2006. The blue dots that are light in color indicate that no bleaching was documented at that time frame. The dark blue dots indicated low bleaching occurrences at that time frame. The yellow dots indicate moderate bleaching, red indicates severe, and the green dots indicate severity unknown. Looking at the map and comparing from 1998 data to 2006 data, we can see there's a definite increase in the number of red and yellow colors indicating severe to moderate bleaching when you compare the 2006 data to the 1998 data. This indicates that there's been an increasing trend in coral bleaching in oceans around the world. Out of all the areas globally, Hawaii appears to be losing the most percentage of coral reefs. Southern Florida by 2050 is expected to lose more coral reefs, as well as Puerto Rico. So this diagram is depicting a progression and forecast in time between 2010 and 2050 as to the potential impact of unmitigated climate change on coral reef cover in the United States. So this is depicting Hawaii, that the percent of coral reef cover is about 38%, and they're expecting it's going to be reduced a little bit in 2025 to 36%, but by 2050 we will have lost most of the coral reefs around Hawaii. Southern Florida looks like it's a 12% coral reef coverage in 2010, and that's going to change and drop to a 3% coral reef coverage by 2025, and hardly any coral reefs remaining by the year 2050. The last one was Puerto Rico. This is a graph that is depicting trends in coral bleaching. It's showing data for the years between 1980 and 2010. The big question is, what happened in 1998 that caused such a ginormous increase in severe coral bleaching? It has been discovered that 1998 was the year that set the record high for coral bleaching because of extremely high ocean temperatures. What also made 1998 severe for coral bleaching was how deep it reached. Typically, it would only harm corals around 15 meters deep, but in 1998 it reached depths of up to about 50 meters where corals were being bleached. The color coding on the bar chart is that gray represents severity unknown, red indicates severe coral bleaching, tan represents moderate, and light peach represents mild. And you can see that since 1980, we started to understand coral bleaching is occurring, and it held steady with a few higher years, especially in 1987. And we're seeing an increasing trend over time with a large spike in 1998 and a moderate spike in 2005. But overall, we're seeing since 1980 to 2010 an increased trend of about 20 countries reporting coral bleaching. This figure just depicts some of the major causes associated with coral bleaching and impacts from humans on marine ecosystems. So, what are the pros and the cons associated with coral reefs and the bleaching that's occurring? Well, one pro is that there's an awareness now. We've had 3 major coral bleaching events, and there is an educational campaign out there to inform people what's going on, that it is directly correlated to climate change and the increased amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, as well as other factors that are stressing and overstressing the corals. So there's an awareness on this topic, and as more and more studies are being done and published, it's becoming a larger issue in the public eye. As the public grows more aware as well, there's an outcry for government action that takes place, and the United Nations or individual nations have been looking at creating laws and different programs to try to protect coral reefs. Coral species can be protected under international, domestic, or even state environmental laws. The last few years have created NOAA or NOAA and its coordinating subparts like the National Ocean Service, Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, National Marine Fisheries Service, and even deals with part of the EPA. So these organizations down here are groups and organizations that are working to study coral reef bleaching and decrease its impact. A huge fighter for conservation in the United States is the Coral Reef Task Force. This agency was actually founded by an executive order by our president, and it was titled the Coral Reef Protection in 1998. In 2000, the United States Coral Reef Task Force adopted the National Action Plan for Coral Reef Conservation. This is the first plan in the United States to comprehensively address the most pressing threats to coral reefs. Coral Reef Conservation Act requires that NOAA report to the U.S. Congress every 2 years regarding the implementation of this national action strategy to protect our coral reefs. The cons of coral reef bleaching is that we lose biodiversity, we can lose fishing industry, lose coastal protection, and tourism. So some solutions for you and I. Reducing pollution and our role in that. Using ecological, organic, sustainable fertilizers. Dispose of your trash safely. Practice safe diving and snorkeling. Volunteer for a cleanup of a reef and conserve water, and definitely take steps to reduce climate change, because that may be one of the main contributing factors to coral reef bleaching. So the previous slide looked at things that we as individuals can do. This slide is highlighting some scientific solutions that are being approached. In Florida, researchers are restoring reefs with tiny coral fragments, and in Hawaii, a coral biologist at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology named Ruth Gates is actually scouring the water for stress-tolerant corals that they can take back to the lab to breed and breed for more hardy individuals and then transplant them back into the natural environment. This is known as selective breeding. Also, there's another scientist in Australia that's doing what's called reseeding, and during a coral breeding episode that happens maybe once or twice a year, the scientists are releasing tiny coral larvae that were bred in a lab to be more tolerant of temperature variations, as well as more tolerant of ocean acidification. Transplanting coral microfragments has definitely worked in Florida, where they have transplanted coral colonies which are now 6 to 8 times larger than what they were prior to this approach. So we are finding some science solutions to help rebuild our coral reefs.